Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history from the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the autumn of 1967, during the renovation of the old courthouse in Braxton County, West Virginia, construction worker Gideon Thorne made a discovery that would challenge everything historians thought they knew about the mountain communities of the Civil War era. Hidden behind a false wall in the basement archive, sealed within a deteriorating leather satchel, were documents that told a story so disturbing that the county clerk, Minerva Hastings, initially refused to believe they were authentic. The documents, dating from 1863 to 1864, detailed the case of two women known locally as the Holloway Sisters, though their real names were recorded as Cordelia and Seraphina Harwick. What made their story particularly chilling was not the accusations of witchcraft that surrounded them, but the methodical documentation of their psychological deterioration and the community's response to behaviors that, even by 1860s standards, defied rational explanation. Dr. Isidore Pemberton, a physician who had studied medicine at the University of Virginia before establishing a practice in the remote mountain settlements, kept meticulous records of his encounters with the sisters. His journals, part of the discovered cache, reveal a man struggling to apply scientific understanding to phenomena that seemed to transcend the medical knowledge of his time. In his own words, recorded in October 1863, Dr. Pemberton wrote that the sisters exhibited symptoms that appeared to follow no known pattern of disease or mental affliction, yet were consistent enough to suggest an underlying cause that remained frustratingly elusive. The Harwick sisters had arrived in the isolated community of Cedar Hollow in late spring of 1862, during the height of the Civil War, when strangers were viewed with particular suspicion. They claimed to be widows from a settlement further south that had been destroyed during a Confederate raid, though they carried no documents to verify their story and spoke with an accent that the locals found difficult to place. Cordelia, the elder at approximately 35 years, was described by those who knew her as a woman of striking appearance but unsettling demeanor. Her sister Seraphina, perhaps 5 years younger, was noted for her habit of speaking in whispers and her tendency to stare directly at people for uncomfortably long periods without blinking. The community of Cedar Hollow consisted of fewer than 200 souls, most of them families who had lived in the mountain hollows for generations. They were suspicious of outsiders under the best of circumstances, and the ongoing war had heightened their natural wariness to near paranoid levels. The arrival of two unaccompanied women claiming to be refugees was extraordinary enough to generate weeks of speculation and gossip. Bartholomew Wickham, who served as both the settlement's unofficial leader and its primary merchant, initially offered the sisters temporary shelter in an abandoned cabin on the outskirts of the community. The cabin had belonged to the Brennan family, who had fled south at the start of the war, leaving behind a small but sturdy dwelling surrounded by overgrown garden plots and a well that, according to local memory, had never run dry even during the worst droughts. For the first several months, the sisters appeared to integrate into the community as well as could be expected. They attended the small Baptist church where Reverend Cornelius Ashford delivered weekly sermons to whoever was available to listen. They purchased supplies from Wickham's store, paying with silver coins that were unusual in their minting, but appeared genuine. Cordelia demonstrated skill with herbal remedies, helping several community members with minor ailments using plants she gathered from the surrounding forests. It was Seraphina's knowledge of medicinal plants that first raised eyebrows among the more observant residents. She seemed to possess an understanding of the local flora that typically took years of living in the mountains to develop, yet she had supposedly arrived from a distant settlement only months before. When questioned about her expertise, she would simply smile and say that plants were the same everywhere if you knew how to listen to them. Dr. Pemberton's first detailed encounter with the sisters occurred in September 1862, when he was summoned to examine Cordelia after she collapsed during Sunday services. His initial assessment noted nothing more alarming than exhaustion and poor nutrition, both common enough conditions during wartime. However, he also recorded several observations that troubled him. Cordelia's pulse was unusually slow, her skin temperature appeared lower than normal, and her pupils showed minimal response to changes in light. When he questioned her about these symptoms, she claimed to feel perfectly well and insisted that she had merely been overcome by the heat in the cramped church building. The winter of 1862-1863 was particularly harsh, with snow falling earlier and more heavily than the old-timers could remember. The sisters' cabin was isolated enough that they could go weeks without being seen, emerging only when necessity demanded trips to Wickham's store for supplies. It was during one of these winter supply runs that Bartholomew Wickham first noticed what he later described as their peculiar relationship with the cold. According to Wickham's written account, discovered among the courthouse documents, the sisters would arrive at his store during blizzards wearing clothing that seemed inadequate for the weather, yet they showed no signs of being affected by the cold. Their skin maintained a normal color, they didn't shiver or seek warmth near his wood stove, and Seraphina had once commented that she found the winter air invigorating rather than unpleasant. Most disturbing to Wickham was the observation that snow didn't seem to accumulate on their clothing or hair the way it did on other customers, as if their body heat was somehow insufficient to melt the flakes as they landed. As spring arrived in 1863, the sisters' behavior began to change in ways that the community found increasingly disturbing. They started making nighttime visits to the small cemetery behind the church, not to tend graves or pay respects, but apparently to sit among the headstones for hours at a time. Several residents reported seeing them there on moonlit nights, sitting perfectly still and silent, facing different directions as if they were keeping watch. Reverend Ashford attempted to address this behavior by speaking with the sisters directly. His account of their conversation, preserved in a letter to his denominational superiors, reveals his growing concern about their spiritual state. When he questioned them about their nocturnal cemetery visits, Cordelia explained that they found the silence of the graveyard conducive to prayer and meditation. When pressed about why they couldn't pray in their own cabin or during regular church services, Seraphina responded that the dead were better listeners than the living because they had no agenda other than peace. The Reverend noted that both sisters spoke about death with a familiarity and comfort that he found deeply unsettling. They didn't discuss it with the reverence and appropriate fear that Christian doctrine demanded, nor with the grief that would be expected from recent widows. Instead, they spoke of death as if it were simply another state of being, no more significant than sleep or wakefulness. Dr. Pemberton was again summoned to examine the sisters in late spring 1863, this time at the request of several community members who had observed them exhibiting what they described as seizures or fits. The physician's journal entry from this period describes a scene that defied his medical training and experience. He arrived at their cabin to find both women conscious and apparently lucid, but displaying synchronized movements that they seemed unable to control or explain. The movements, as Dr. Pemberton documented them, consisted of rhythmic swaying motions accompanied by low humming sounds that seemed to harmonize despite neither sister appearing to listen to the other. When he spoke to them, they responded normally and intelligently, but the swaying and humming continued throughout the conversation. When he asked them to stop the movements, they claimed not to understand what he was referring to, as if they were completely unaware of their own actions. Most disturbing to the physician was his observation that the sisters' movements were perfectly synchronized despite their sitting several feet apart and not appearing to pay attention to each other. The humming sounds they produced created harmonies that suggested musical training, yet both sisters claimed to have no particular musical abilities and couldn't explain the sounds they were making. During this same visit, Dr. Pemberton noted other abnormalities that he struggled to document in medical terms. Both sisters' hair had begun to change color, shifting from their original brown to a shade that he described as almost translucent in certain lights. Their fingernails had become unusually long and hard, despite showing no signs of deliberate growth or care. Most puzzling was their breathing pattern, which seemed to slow dramatically when they weren't speaking, to the point where the physician sometimes had difficulty determining whether they were still breathing at all. The community's tolerance for the sisters' increasingly strange behavior began to erode as summer progressed. Reports began circulating of unusual occurrences in the vicinity of their cabin. Animals found dead without apparent cause, plants withering despite adequate rainfall, and a persistent odor that residents described as resembling old flowers mixed with damp earth. Bartholomew Wickham documented several specific incidents that contributed to the growing fear surrounding the sisters. In June 1863, 3 of his chickens were found dead near the fence that bordered the sisters' property. The birds showed no signs of predation or disease, but their bodies were discovered arranged in a precise triangular pattern that suggested deliberate placement. When Wickham questioned the sisters about the incident, they expressed surprise and offered to pay for the lost poultry, but their demeanor struck him as oddly detached, as if they were responding to news about events in a distant location rather than something that had occurred on their own property. A more serious incident occurred in July when young Ephraim Morrison, the 17-year-old son of a local family, fell seriously ill after accepting water from the sisters' well during a particularly hot day. The youth had been helping with harvest work on farms throughout the area and had stopped at the sisters' cabin seeking refreshment. According to his own account, given to Dr. Pemberton after his recovery, Cordelia had invited him to drink from their well, claiming that their water was especially pure and refreshing. Within hours of consuming the water, Ephraim began experiencing symptoms that Dr. Pemberton found difficult to categorize. The young man reported vivid hallucinations involving conversations with deceased relatives, periods of lost time where he couldn't account for his actions or whereabouts, and a persistent sensation that his thoughts were being observed or influenced by an external presence. Most alarming was his claim that he could hear the sisters' voices even when they were nowhere nearby, speaking to him in languages he didn't recognize, but somehow understood. Dr. Pemberton's treatment consisted primarily of induced vomiting and purgatives, standard medical responses to suspected poisoning. However, the physician privately noted that Ephraim's symptoms didn't correspond to any known toxins or diseases. The hallucinations were too specific and coherent to suggest ergot poisoning or other common causes of delirium, and the duration of the symptoms extended far beyond what would be expected from contaminated water. The incident with Ephraim Morrison marked a turning point in the community's relationship with the sisters. What had been suspicion and unease transformed into active fear and hostility. Reverend Ashford began delivering sermons that, while not explicitly naming the sisters, clearly referenced the dangers of harboring evil influences within the community. Bartholomew Wickham stopped extending credit for supplies and began requiring immediate payment for all purchases. Most significantly, Dr. Pemberton initiated what he termed observational studies of the sisters, attempting to document their behavior in a systematic way that might provide insights into their condition. The physician's detailed observations, conducted over several weeks during the late summer of 1863, paint a picture of 2 individuals whose behavior had become so far outside normal human parameters that he began to question his own sanity. He documented their daily routines, noting that they seemed to require very little sleep, often remaining active throughout the night hours. Their eating habits were minimal and irregular, with both sisters sometimes going days without consuming food, yet showing no signs of weakness or hunger. Most puzzling to Dr. Pemberton was their apparent ability to coordinate their actions without visible or audible communication. He observed instances where one sister would begin preparing for an activity moments before the other would arrive to participate, as if they possessed some form of shared awareness that transcended normal human senses. When he questioned them about this coordination, they seemed genuinely puzzled by his inquiries and claimed that they simply understood each other well after years of living together. The physician's scientific training led him to hypothesize various explanations for the sisters' condition. He considered the possibility of shared delusions brought on by psychological trauma from their supposed wartime experiences. He investigated potential environmental causes, testing the water from their well and examining the plants in their garden for toxic properties. He even explored the possibility that they might be suffering from some unknown disease that affected their nervous systems in ways that medicine hadn't yet discovered. However, every rational explanation seemed to fall short of accounting for the full scope of their unusual behavior. The sisters' physical health appeared excellent by all conventional measures, yet they exhibited symptoms that suggested profound neurological abnormalities. Their mental faculties seemed intact when assessed individually, yet their synchronized behaviors suggested either shared psychological dysfunction or some form of coordination that defied medical understanding. As autumn approached, the tensions between the sisters and the broader community reached a critical point. Several families began avoiding the area around their cabin entirely, forcing them to take longer routes when traveling between farms or to Wickham's store. The sisters' presence in church became increasingly uncomfortable for other congregants, who complained that the women's behavior during services was disruptive and disturbing. Reverend Ashford documented specific incidents that contributed to this growing alienation. During prayer, both sisters would remain standing while everyone else knelt, claiming that their backs prevented them from assuming the proper position. During hymns, their voices could be heard harmonizing in ways that, while technically beautiful, seemed to transform familiar songs into something alien and unsettling. Most disturbing was their habit of staring at other congregants during the reverend's sermons, not with the polite attention expected during religious services, but with an intense focus that made people feel observed and judged. The situation escalated dramatically in October 1863, when Minerva Wickham, Bartholomew's wife, claimed to have witnessed the sisters engaged in what she described as ritualistic behavior near the creek that provided water for much of the community. According to her account, she had gone to the creek early in the morning to collect water for washing and discovered the sisters standing waist-deep in the flowing stream, facing each other with their arms raised above their heads. What made the scene particularly disturbing, according to Minerva Wickham's testimony, was not just their unusual posture, but the fact that they remained motionless for the entire time she observed them, which she estimated at nearly an hour. They didn't speak, didn't appear to be performing any recognizable religious or cultural ceremony, and showed no awareness of her presence despite being clearly visible from her position on the bank. Most unsettling was her observation that the water around the sisters appeared different from the rest of the stream. While the creek normally ran clear, the water immediately surrounding the women seemed darker and moved in patterns that didn't correspond to the natural flow of the current. When she finally gathered enough courage to call out to them, they turned to look at her in perfect synchronization, their expressions showing neither surprise nor embarrassment at being discovered in such circumstances. Dr. Pemberton investigated Minerva Wickham's claims by examining the creek water where the incident allegedly occurred. His analysis conducted using the limited testing methods available in 1863, revealed nothing unusual in the water's composition or appearance. However, he noted in his journal that several fish were found dead downstream from the location, their bodies showing no signs of injury or disease, but displaying what he described as unusual rigidity that persisted even after death. The physician's scientific skepticism led him to question whether Minerva Wickham might have misinterpreted innocent behavior, perhaps observing the sisters engaged in some form of medical treatment or personal hygiene routine. However, when he approached them directly about the incident, their response troubled him deeply. Rather than denying the behavior or offering an innocent explanation, both sisters simply stared at him in silence for several minutes before Cordelia finally asked whether he had come to examine them again or simply to satisfy his curiosity about things that didn't concern him. The approaching winter of 1863-1864 brought new challenges as the community grappled with the sisters' continuing presence. Food stores were limited due to the ongoing war, and the normal spirit of mutual assistance that helped mountain communities survive harsh seasons was complicated by the fear and suspicion surrounding Cordelia and Seraphina. Several families privately approached Bartholomew Wickham about the possibility of forcing the sisters to leave the area, but the lack of any actual crimes or legal violations made such action problematic. Dr. Pemberton found himself in an increasingly difficult position as the only community member with any claim to authority regarding medical or psychological matters. His scientific training compelled him to continue studying the sisters' condition, yet his growing unease about their behavior made him question whether such study might be dangerous. His journal entries from this period reveal a man struggling with doubts about his own perceptions and sanity. In November 1863, the physician made a decision that would prove to have devastating consequences for all involved. Believing that the sisters' condition might be related to their isolated living situation, he arranged for them to stay temporarily in the home of Cornelius and Patience Drummond, an older couple whose own small dwelling was located closer to the center of the community. The Drummonds had agreed to the arrangement partly out of Christian charity and partly because Dr. Pemberton had convinced them that closer observation might help him develop a treatment for whatever was affecting the sisters. The Drummond household consisted of Cornelius, a retired blacksmith in his 60s, his wife Patience, and their unmarried son Jeremiah, a man of about 30 who had been injured during military service and had returned home to help with the family's small farm. The family had lived in Cedar Hollow for over 20 years and was respected by their neighbors for their strong work ethic and religious devotion. Dr. Pemberton's plan was to monitor the sisters' behavior in a more controlled environment, while also determining whether their unusual symptoms might be related to something specific about their isolated cabin. He hypothesized that environmental factors such as contaminated well water, toxic molds, or naturally occurring gases might be causing their symptoms, and that relocation might lead to improvement in their condition. The arrangement began in late November with what appeared to be positive results. Both sisters seemed more animated and social when living in closer proximity to other people. They participated in household tasks, contributed to conversations, and showed what Dr. Pemberton interpreted as signs of psychological improvement. Cordelia assisted Patience Drummond with cooking and preservation of winter food supplies, while Seraphina helped Jeremiah with minor repairs and maintenance tasks, despite his physical limitations. However, this apparent improvement lasted only a few weeks before new and more disturbing behaviors began to emerge. The Drummond family started reporting that both sisters would disappear from their beds during the night hours, returning before dawn with no explanation for their absence. When questioned about these nocturnal wanderings, the sisters claimed to have no memory of leaving the house and expressed confusion about why anyone would think they had been absent. More troubling were the changes that began affecting the Drummond family themselves. Patients complained of vivid dreams involving conversations with deceased relatives, similar to the symptoms experienced earlier by young Ephraim Morrison. Jeremiah reported hearing voices calling his name from outside the house, voices that seemed to come from the sisters even when they were clearly asleep in their beds. Most disturbing was Cornelius Drummond's gradual decline into what Dr. Pemberton initially diagnosed as depression, but which soon began to resemble something far more serious. The elder Drummond began exhibiting behaviors that his family found completely out of character. A man who had previously been known for his steady temperament and practical approach to problems became increasingly agitated and paranoid. He accused his neighbors of plotting against his family, claimed to hear threatening messages in casual conversations, and began spending hours staring out windows as if watching for some anticipated danger. Dr. Pemberton attempted to treat Cornelius Drummond with standard remedies for nervous disorders, including laudanum and herbal sedatives, but the man's condition continued to deteriorate. More alarming was the physician's observation that Drummond's symptoms seemed to mirror, in some ways, the synchronized behaviors he had documented in the sisters. The older man began exhibiting rhythmic movements and producing low humming sounds, particularly during the evening hours when the sisters were present. By December 1863, the situation in the Drummond household had become untenable. The family was requesting that the sisters be relocated, but winter weather made moving them back to their isolated cabin problematic. Dr. Pemberton found himself managing what amounted to 5 patients instead of 2, as every member of the Drummond family was now exhibiting symptoms that defied his medical understanding. The crisis reached its peak on the night of December 21st, the winter solstice. According to the accounts preserved in the courthouse documents, all 5 individuals in the Drummond house simultaneously experienced what witnesses described as a form of collective seizure or trance state. Neighbors who lived nearby reported hearing unusual sounds from the house, low humming or chanting that seemed to involve multiple voices harmonizing in patterns that were both musical and deeply unsettling. When concerned neighbors investigated the next morning, they found all 5 occupants of the house standing motionless in the main room, arranged in a precise circle facing inward toward each other. Their eyes were open, and they appeared conscious, but none of them responded to questions or seemed aware of the visitor's presence. They remained in this position for several hours before gradually returning to normal consciousness, with no memory of the incident or explanation for their behavior. Dr. Pemberton's account of this event, written several days later, reveals a man whose scientific worldview had been fundamentally shaken. He admitted that he could provide no medical explanation for what had occurred and began to question whether the sisters' condition might be related to factors that fell outside the scope of conventional medicine. Most troubling was his observation that the incident seemed to have created a permanent change in the Drummond family, who continued to exhibit subtle behavioral abnormalities even after the sisters were relocated. The decision to move the sisters back to their isolated cabin was made immediately following the solstice incident, despite the hazardous winter conditions. The community had reached a consensus that whatever was affecting the women was somehow contagious or transmissible to others, and that physical separation was the only way to protect the broader population. Several men from the community volunteered to escort the sisters back to their dwelling and to ensure that they remained there for the remainder of the winter. However, when the escort party arrived at the sisters' cabin the following day, they discovered that Cordelia and Serafina were already there, despite having been left at the Drummond house the previous evening. The men found them sitting by a fire in their main room, apparently engaged in normal domestic activities, with no explanation for how they had traveled several miles through difficult terrain during a winter night. When questioned about their nighttime journey, the sisters seemed genuinely puzzled by the inquiries. They claimed to have been in their cabin all along and expressed confusion about why anyone would think otherwise. Most disturbing to the escort party was the fact that there were no tracks in the snow leading to or from the cabin, despite the fresh snowfall that had occurred throughout the night. The isolation imposed on the sisters following the December incident was intended to be temporary, lasting only until spring weather would allow for a more permanent solution to their presence in the community. However, as the weeks passed with no contact with the outside world, reports began reaching the rest of the community that suggested the sisters' condition was continuing to deteriorate in ways that were both disturbing and inexplicable. Hunters and trappers working in the forests around the sisters' cabin reported seeing strange lights emanating from their dwelling during the nighttime hours, lights that didn't appear to come from normal oil lamps or fires. The illumination was described as having an unusual color, somewhere between blue and green, and seemed to pulse or flicker in patterns that suggested some form of intentional signaling, rather than random variations in flame intensity. More troubling were reports of sounds coming from the area around the cabin, sounds that didn't correspond to any normal human activities. Witnesses described hearing what sounded like multiple voices speaking or chanting in languages they couldn't identify, often continuing for hours during the night. Some reported hearing what sounded like music, but played on instruments that no one in the community possessed or recognized. Dr. Pemberton attempted to investigate these reports by conducting nighttime observations of the cabin from a distance, using a position in the forest that provided a clear view of the dwelling, while maintaining enough separation to ensure his own safety. His journal entries from these observation sessions describe phenomena that challenged his attempts to maintain scientific objectivity. On multiple occasions, the physician observed figures moving around the exterior of the cabin in patterns that seemed too complex and coordinated to be the result of normal household activities. The figures appeared to be performing some form of ritual or ceremony, moving in circles and geometric patterns while maintaining perfect synchronization despite the darkness and uneven terrain. Most disturbing to Dr. Pemberton was his observation that there appeared to be more figures participating in these activities than could be accounted for by the two sisters alone. He counted what seemed to be at least 4, and possibly more, distinct silhouettes moving in the patterns around the cabin. Yet when he attempted to get closer to confirm his observations, the figures would vanish, leaving only the two sisters visible through the cabin's windows, apparently engaged in normal evening activities. The physician began to question his own perceptions, wondering whether the isolation and stress of the situation might be causing him to see things that weren't actually there. However, his doubts were dispelled when other community members, observing the cabin independently, reported similar sightings of unexplained figures participating in nighttime activities around the dwelling. As winter gradually gave way to spring in 1864, the community faced a difficult decision about how to handle the sisters' continuing presence. The isolation strategy had clearly failed to resolve their condition, and if anything, their behavior seemed to be becoming more extreme and disturbing with each passing week. Several community members advocated for forcing the sisters to leave the area entirely, arguing that their presence posed a continuing threat to the mental and spiritual health of the broader population. However, practical considerations made such forced relocation problematic. The sisters had committed no actual crimes that would justify legal action against them, and their apparent mental instability made it unlikely that they would be capable of surviving on their own in unfamiliar territory. Most troubling was the possibility that relocating them might simply transfer their disturbing influence to some other unsuspecting community. Dr. Pemberton found himself increasingly isolated in his attempts to find a rational solution to the sisters' condition. His scientific training had convinced him that there must be some underlying medical or psychological explanation for their behavior. But months of observation and study had failed to provide any insights that could lead to effective treatment. More disturbing was his growing suspicion that his own mental state was being affected by prolonged exposure to their influence. The physician's journal entries from early 1864 reveal a man struggling with doubts about his own sanity and competence. He described experiencing vivid dreams involving conversations with patients he had treated years earlier, some of whom had died under his care. He reported hearing voices calling his name from empty rooms and finding objects in his home that he couldn't remember placing there. Most troubling was his observation that these symptoms seemed to intensify following his visits to observe the sisters' cabin, suggesting a correlation that his scientific mind couldn't ignore. The crisis reached its final phase in March 1864, when several community members reported that the sisters' cabin appeared to be abandoned. Smoke was no longer visible from their chimney, no lights were observed during the nighttime hours, and the general sense of unease that had surrounded the area seemed to have dissipated. When a group of men volunteered to investigate, they found the cabin empty, with no signs of the sisters' presence and no indication of where they might have gone. The interior of the cabin showed signs of hasty departure, with personal belongings scattered about and food preparation interrupted, as if the occupants had left suddenly. However, there were also indications that the departure might not have been entirely voluntary. Furniture was overturned, windows were left open despite the cold weather, and there were stains on the floor that appeared to be blood, though not in quantities that suggested serious injury or violence. Most puzzling was the discovery of what appeared to be writings or symbols carved into the wooden walls of the cabin's interior. The markings didn't correspond to any alphabet or symbolic system known to the community members, and their precise geometric patterns suggested deliberate creation rather than random damage. Dr. Pemberton attempted to document these symbols, but found that his sketches never seemed to capture their exact appearance, as if the markings somehow resisted accurate reproduction. The search for the sisters expanded to include the surrounding forest and neighboring settlements, but no trace of them was found. It was as if two women had simply vanished from existence, leaving behind only the disturbing memories of their 18-month presence in the community and the unanswered questions about their true condition. In the weeks following the sisters' disappearance, several community members reported continued sightings of unexplained figures in the forest around the abandoned cabin. These sightings gradually decreased in frequency, but never entirely ceased, leading to the area being generally avoided by hunters and travelers. The cabin itself remained empty, with no one willing to claim or occupy the dwelling, despite the ongoing housing shortages created by the war. Dr. Pemberton's investigation into the sisters' disappearance revealed one final piece of evidence that would haunt him for the remainder of his life. While examining the abandoned cabin for clues about their departure, he discovered a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards containing what appeared to be a collection of personal items from various community members: locks of hair, pieces of clothing, small jewelry items, and other objects that individuals would later confirm as having gone missing over the previous months. More disturbing was the discovery of detailed written observations about each community member, recorded in handwriting that matched samples from both sisters, yet contained information that they shouldn't have possessed. The writings included intimate details about people's private conversations, family secrets, personal fears, and even thoughts and dreams that individuals had never shared with anyone. The physician realized that the sisters had somehow been monitoring and recording the private lives of the entire community with an accuracy and thoroughness that suggested either impossible surveillance capabilities or some form of mental intrusion that defied all rational explanation. The discovery forced him to confront the possibility that whatever had been affecting the sisters might have been far more complex and threatening than he had originally believed. Dr. Pemberton's final journal entry regarding the case, dated April 15, 1864, reveals a man whose worldview had been fundamentally altered by his experiences. He wrote that his investigation had convinced him that there were aspects of human psychology and behavior that fell outside the scope of conventional medical knowledge, and that some conditions might require explanations that science was not yet prepared to provide. The physician concluded that the sister's condition, whatever its ultimate cause, had represented a form of psychological contagion that could affect others through proximity and extended contact. He theorized that their apparent ability to influence the thoughts and behaviors of other community members suggested some form of shared consciousness or mental connection that transcended individual identity in ways that medical science couldn't adequately explain or treat. Most troubling was his final observation that the effects of the sisters' influence seemed to persist even after their disappearance. Several community members, including himself, continued to experience symptoms similar to those they had exhibited during the sisters' presence: vivid dreams involving deceased relatives, sensations of being observed when alone, and occasional episodes of lost time where they couldn't account for their actions or whereabouts. The aftermath of the sisters' disappearance created lasting changes in the Cedar Hollow community that persisted long after the Civil War ended and normal life resumed. Several families chose to relocate to other areas, claiming that the community no longer felt safe or familiar to them. Those who remained rarely discussed the events of 1863-1864, and visitors to the area often commented on the unusual reserve and guardedness of the local residents. The abandoned cabin became a source of continuing unease for the community. Despite its solid construction and desirable location, no one was willing to occupy or purchase the dwelling. Several attempts were made to demolish the structure, but each effort was abandoned after workers reported experiencing disturbing symptoms similar to those that had affected community members during the sisters' residence. Disorientation, auditory hallucinations, and sensations of being watched or followed. In 1966, almost exactly a century after the sisters' disappearance, the cabin was finally destroyed by a fire of unknown origin. Local fire departments reported that the blaze burned with unusual intensity and speed, consuming the structure completely within a matter of hours. Most puzzling was their observation that the fire seemed to burn primarily upward, creating a column of flame that reached unusually high into the sky while leaving the surrounding vegetation largely untouched. The discovery of Dr. Pemberton's records and other documents in the courthouse basement provided the first comprehensive account of the events that had transpired in Cedar Hollow during the Civil War years. However, the documents also raised new questions about the ultimate fate of Cordelia and Serafina Harwick, and whether their influence on the community had truly ended with their physical departure. Research conducted by local historians following the document discovery revealed that similar cases of unexplained psychological disturbances had been reported in other isolated communities throughout the Appalachian region during the same general time period. While most of these reports lacked the detailed documentation provided by Dr. Pemberton's journals, the similarities in described symptoms and community responses suggested that the Cedar Hollow incident might not have been entirely unique. The historian's investigation also uncovered evidence suggesting that the sisters' true identities and origins remained mysterious even after all the years of documentation. Census records, military reports, and other official documents from the Civil War period contained no references to individuals matching their descriptions or the names they had provided to the community. It was as if Cordelia and Serafina Harwick had appeared from nowhere and disappeared back into the same void. Most troubling was the discovery of reports from other communities describing visits from two women matching the sisters' physical descriptions during the years following their disappearance from Cedar Hollow. These reports, scattered across several states and spanning multiple decades, suggested that the sisters might have continued their pattern of settling temporarily in isolated communities before moving on, leaving behind the same trail of psychological disturbance and unanswered questions. The final entry in the courthouse documents collection was a letter dated 1943, written by an elderly Dr. Pemberton to his nephew, a physician practicing in Charleston. In the letter, the aging doctor reflected on his experiences with the sisters and warned his nephew about the limitations of medical science in dealing with certain types of human psychological abnormalities. Dr. Pemberton wrote that his investigation of the sisters' case had convinced him that there existed forms of mental illness or psychological dysfunction that could spread from person to person through mechanisms that conventional medicine didn't understand. He theorized that some individuals might possess psychological characteristics that allowed them to influence the thoughts and behaviors of others in ways that resembled disease transmission, but operated through entirely different processes. The physician's final warning was that such cases required extreme caution and professional humility, as attempts to study or treat such conditions could result in the investigator becoming affected by the same disturbances they were attempting to understand. He advised his nephew that if he ever encountered patients exhibiting symptoms similar to those he had described, the safest course of action might be to maintain professional distance and avoid prolonged contact or investigation. The letter concluded with a personal confession that haunted Dr. Pemberton throughout his remaining years. He admitted that he had never been able to determine whether the sisters had been genuine victims of some unknown psychological condition, deliberate practitioners of some form of mental manipulation, or something else entirely that fell outside normal categories of human understanding. Most disturbing was his final observation that the question of their ultimate nature might be less important than the recognition that such individuals existed and possessed capabilities that could profoundly affect the mental stability of entire communities, whether through disease, deliberate action, or some other mechanism. The sisters had demonstrated an ability to alter the psychological state of everyone who came into contact with them, creating changes that persisted long after their physical presence had ended. The legacy of the Harwick sisters case extends beyond the immediate community where the events occurred. The detailed documentation provided by Dr. Pemberton's records has become a subject of study for researchers interested in historical cases of mass psychological disturbance, though the mechanisms underlying the sisters' apparent influence remain as mysterious today as they were in 1864. Modern psychological and medical analysis of the documented symptoms suggests several possible explanations for the events in Cedar Hollow, ranging from ergot poisoning to shared psychotic disorders to elaborate forms of psychological manipulation. However, none of these explanations adequately accounts for all the documented phenomena, particularly the sisters' apparent ability to coordinate their actions without visible communication and their influence on others through mere proximity. The case has also attracted attention from researchers studying the historical treatment of mental illness in rural communities, as it provides rare detailed documentation of how isolated settlements dealt with individuals whose behavior fell far outside accepted norms. Dr. Pemberton's attempts to apply scientific medical analysis to the sisters' condition illustrate both the limitations of 1860s medical knowledge and the challenges faced by practitioners trying to understand psychological phenomena that didn't fit established diagnostic categories. Perhaps most significantly, the Cedar Hollow case serves as a reminder that human psychology and behavior can manifest in forms that challenge our assumptions about individual identity, consciousness, and the boundaries between one person's mental state and another's. Whether the sisters were victims of an unknown condition, practitioners of sophisticated psychological manipulation, or something else entirely, their impact on their community demonstrates the profound ways in which unusual psychological phenomena can affect entire social groups. The final question raised by the case is whether similar individuals might exist in contemporary society possessing psychological characteristics that allow them to influence others in ways that modern psychology and psychiatry are not yet equipped to recognize or understand. The sisters' apparent ability to create lasting changes in the mental state of everyone who encountered them suggests possibilities about human consciousness and interpersonal influence that remain largely unexplored by conventional research. Today, the site where Cedar Hollow once thrived is largely uninhabited forest land, with only scattered foundations and overgrown clearings marking where the community existed. Hikers and hunters occasionally report unusual sensations when passing through the area. Feelings of being watched, sounds that don't correspond to local wildlife, and a general sense of unease that seems to have no rational explanation. Whether these contemporary reports represent psychological suggestion influenced by knowledge of the area's history, environmental factors that contributed to the original disturbances, or something else entirely, remains an open question. What seems certain is that the events of 1863-1864 created changes in that particular location that have persisted far beyond the lives of the original participants. The story of Cordelia and Serafina Harwick ultimately serves as a reminder that human behavior can sometimes transcend the boundaries of our understanding, creating phenomena that challenge our assumptions about psychology, consciousness, and the nature of individual identity. Whether their condition was medical, psychological, or something that falls outside conventional categories entirely, their impact on the Cedar Hollow community demonstrates the profound ways in which unusual human characteristics can affect the lives of others. As we consider the implications of their story, we might reflect on the possibility that similar individuals exist in our contemporary world, possessing psychological characteristics that allow them to influence others in ways that our current understanding of human behavior cannot adequately explain. The sisters' case suggests that there remain aspects of human consciousness and interpersonal dynamics that science has yet to explore, and that some of the most disturbing human phenomena might arise not from supernatural causes, but from natural human capabilities that we have yet to recognize or understand. The mountain communities of Appalachia, with their long history of isolation and self-reliance, have always harbored stories of individuals whose behavior defied conventional explanation. The case of the Harwick sisters represents one of the few instances where such events were documented with sufficient detail to allow for serious analysis. Yet even this documentation raises more questions than it answers. Perhaps the most sobering lesson of their story is the recognition that human psychology can manifest in forms that challenge our most basic assumptions about individual identity and interpersonal influence. Whether the sisters were victims or perpetrators, whether their condition was natural or deliberately cultivated, their impact on everyone who encountered them demonstrates that there remain aspects of human behavior that fall outside our current frameworks of understanding. As we close this account of one of the most disturbing cases in the recorded history of the Appalachian region, we are left with the unsettling possibility that such individuals might exist anywhere, in any community, possessing capabilities that could profoundly affect the lives of those around them while remaining largely invisible to conventional forms of detection or understanding. The sisters disappeared into the mountains more than a century ago, but the questions they raised about the nature of human consciousness, identity, and interpersonal influence remain as relevant today as they were during the winter of 1864. Their legacy serves as a reminder that the human mind can manifest in ways that transcend our categories of understanding, and that some of the most profound mysteries of human behavior might be found not in distant laboratories or academic institutions, but in the quiet communities where ordinary people encounter phenomena that challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of human existence.